Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Evangelical Dark Web. Tonight, we're going to be covering, it's a debate in a sense, the interview that Doug Wilson did on Auron MacIntyre's channel. And this is a very impactful interview, I think, because it revealed a lot of things. And I don't think it was Doug Wilson's best moment. I think it revealed a lot of the shortcomings in the entire crusade. I don't want to say it's a crusade. Jihad might be a better way to put it. Against, people on the right by people in the church. And it's a good confrontation of the woke wars too, because I think Auron MacIntyre is someone that's very sympathetic to our side of the things. And Doug Wilson has been someone that I think has been unnecessarily antagonistic.
Well, one might say he has literally burned bridges.
Right. He's done a lot of that. So we're going to dive into this, and I think it was a really cool, a really good moment. Like, there's a lot of a lot revealed here, I think. So we're going to dive into that. But first, how are you doing?
All is well. I was kind of excited to talk about this issue. So,
I know it's like I every week at the start, I'm like, what am I going to do a live stream on this Thursday? But God provides the topics. That is
and it's
absolutely true.
and it's not. It's very ironic or funny that having just seen Auron MacIntyre in the past week, it's just like in the flesh. So it's kind of funny doing a live stream on him specifically in his show with regards to Doug Wilson. So it's just very ironic, very poignant.
I mean, I've met Auron MacIntyre as well. I met him at the Right Response conference, and he's a real guy. Like, he is exactly as he is on video, is exactly how he is in person. So
he might even be more based in person.
I think it's the exactly the same. So this interview that he did with Doug Wilson, it comes off the heels of just a lot going on with the woke right debate, and Doug Wilson wrote an article that legitimizes the term, and he tries to frame it as Nietzschean things, some philosophabble nonsense. And this is a very a friendly, cordial, but very confrontational discussion, and it's a quasi debate in a way. And I think Auron MacIntyre effectively won the issue. And what's very interesting, because I was able to catch the beginning of this live, and the live chat really did not like Doug Wilson.
Even most of the comment section, like on the YouTube
I haven't checked the comment section yet.
It is very negative towards Wilson overall,
and
or neutral.
Doug Wilson is someone that should have an overlapping popularity between the audience of Auron MacIntyre and the audience of Canon Press, obviously.
Well, maybe, but the problem is
yes.
Auron has probably a lot of those anons that these people bash repeatedly and habitually are in Auron's audience. And I think that's part of the reason why Doug Wilson was willing to go into the lion's den in this case. And again, I was just, having actually just seen Auron, I had confidence that he wasn't just going to bend over backwards and like give him a softball interview. And he overall does not do that. It is
no, he doesn't.
And it's not like he's going knife to the throat. He actually is, rather cordial, almost diplomatic, and almost letting him kind of hang himself in terms of his incoherence.
Yeah. So let's dive in, because this might be a long one.
Yes.
I'm going to jump in at the 4-minute, 57-second mark. We're going to watch all of this at 1.25 speed, hopefully for just as much brevity as we can get. And that's the plan. So in a sense,
I think you put up the wrong thing, but
there we go.
The term apply to anybody. Yeah, I think as I conclude the article, I think it applies to black-pilled Nietzscheans. I think it applies to the Andrew Tates of the world. I think it applies to people who are out there and who have adopted the oppressor-oppressed bifurcation, that binary. Only they've tried to flip who's the oppressor and who's the oppressed. Any Christian who believes in the Last Judgment or the fundamental antithesis between righteousness and unrighteousness, has to recognize that there may be people on my side of the political divide that are bad guys, and that there may be guys on the other side who aren't as bad as some of my guys are. So, for example, David had Joab on his side, and Joab was a skunk, a very clear-thinking skunk, but a skunk, a murderer and shrewd politician. And Abner, a very noble man, was on the other side. So, someone who believes in God's sovereignty and God's unbending law knows that it doesn't necessarily, God's judgments don't necessarily cut along our partisan factions, right? But when someone doesn't believe in God, there is no fear of God in their categorizations at all. And they are just saying, if he's white, I'm on his side no matter what he did. And if he's black, I'm against him no matter what he did. Or if he's a Jew, no matter what he did. I would say the woke right does apply to him. But again, if someone like Neil Shenvi finds that guy, he then wants to apply that term to everybody on the right who's fighting effectively at all. And that just murks everything up.
Right. So as you were saying there, that
You're muted.
Yeah. So I'm not sure it was just this comment, but it seems like I'm getting the impression that Doug Wilson overall is trying to link Stonequire to Andrew Tate, which I don't see a connection there.
I mean, he does try.
That's really what we're all talking about.
The Nietzschean thing is also a Bronze Age pervert is another one. I mean, it is part of the, I don't want to overuse the term post-war consensus, but that is very much apparently embedded into the ideology of the post-war consensus, is to brand your opponents as Nietzschean and to basically, especially denigrate that and a lot of other philosophers, particularly turn of the century ones. So that is a common and, historic tactic. I mean, I listened to that,
I mean, I'm someone who doesn't really care about philosophy. I think it's like the most overrated of the social sciences. Maybe economics might also be up there just because people use that as an excuse to worship GDP. But yeah, it's just you're labeling everything as Nietzschean. It's not a very helpful label because most people don't understand Nietzsche.
Even reading Nietzsche doesn't necessarily make you understand him. I mean, part of it is that it is a denigration of heroism and scholarly or even monastic pursuit.
It reminds me of Steve Dace, who constantly misuses the term nihilism. I remember that back in the day. So because that's what they're really saying. Nietzsche nihilism is basically.
Or wait, I'm thinking there. I mean, so there is a tendency to want to bash men who pursue greatness, and that's part of what the tendency is. And also, I mean, just his clarification on woke. I mean, the whole oppressor versus oppressed dynamic. I just don't buy that as the defining pinnacle of what is or is not wokeness. I think obviously, if you ask the woke themselves, the actual Eric Mason wokeness, Benjamin Watson wokeness. Like what they appeal to is generally a concept called double consciousness. So when the left uses the term woke, or talks about oppression, they're talking about things that are subtle that you can't actually see. The racism that's implicit in the system, or the implicit bias that one may or may not have.
Let me give a clarification on that. They believe that there can be racism without actual racists.
Yes.
No one on the right believes that.
Or disparate impact is racist in and of itself. The right is not making an argument of subtle or covert or like underneath the surface or however you want to phrase it. They're actually appealing to tangible, grievances. And again, even Doug Wilson appeals to the books, The Unprotected Class by Jeremy Carl and The Age of Entitlement by Christopher Caldwell. He appeals to both of those two books. Yet at the same time, he's basically going to bash people that try to redress those grievances laid out in the book as woke right, which, certainly James Lindsay, Neil Shenvi, and all these other people who popularized the term are using it. Yet he still wants to kind of say that the term is legitimate, even though he's critiquing the people who more or less put the term into the political discourse.
Shout out to Dan Crenshaw, also known as Eye Patch McCain, because I believe he was the first user of the term woke right, which shows you what the intended use was always for. attacking people that are actually on the right, because Dan Crenshaw's a liberal. You said you wanted to skip ahead to the 40-minute mark.
Yeah, because I mean, one thing you're going to notice about Doug Wilson in this, I mean, this is not his best performance at all. He's very, I guess, incoherent.
This
very much
part that you want to
rambly.
skip to is, I actually wanted to skip past this part, but you said no, we got to endure the
Yeah, I think
more
we
or
got
less
a couple
ramble
more
of
seconds. But I mean, they talk about Netter, which I don't think is a particularly helpful conversation because Wilson kind of like he'll agree with what Auron says, he'll kind of backtrack and then work his way to like contradicting what he just agreed to, or like bloviating to the point where it doesn't, where he's just saying something completely different. I mean, again, I think Netter is entirely unhelpful and useless at this point, and that's because people are just too stupid to comprehend the English language and just understand basic political realities.
I
And that
think
we should just,
Netter is something that you do. It's not something that you talk about doing.
well, yeah, but I think it's too. I think it's to the point where it's just unhelpful. We should just resort to saying friend v enemy, and if they hate you for that, who cares? They're going to hate you for something else anyway. And at the end of the day, politics is friend v enemy. And Netter was just kind of a way to build a coalition. But obviously, a lot of these people don't want to build coalitions. And the term is just probably past its point of usefulness, which is unfortunate because I like Charles Hayward.
Yeah, he's definitely one of the most based guests I've ever had on here. And he's definitely welcome back. Anyway, let's dive in. This is in the middle. The context here, I believe, is Doug Wilson talking about like federal infiltration and stuff like that.
Yes. So they just got they just got past talking about Netter. They just got past talking about critical theory. They also, like, Doug Wilson basically asked the question of why he, of all people, is being harassed by people who are calling him a compromiser. Yet he doesn't actually understand that the reason they're calling him a compromiser is because he's kind of like philo-Semitic and Judaizing, which, again, there are other reasons to call him a compromiser with his statements on homosexuality and concupiscence, along with
his statements on the Civil Rights Act.
The Abigail Nabal statement, which was, again, last year. I mean, again, Doug Wilson's been given a lot of grace for someone that has a lot of bad theology. Yet, because he is now shooting at other people, often in defense of one group of people, that's why he's being called a compromiser. That's why a lot of people that supported him are now kind of detracting from him.
Yeah, because what matters in this day and age isn't necessarily that someone has the perfect theology; it's that they're loyal
and a fighter.
Yeah, they fight and they're loyal to. It's a mutual loyalty. What servant leadership is actually supposed to mean, not rule by the servants is what people think it means, but that's what it means. And Doug Wilson has kind of abandoned that, and we'll provide an example of that when we talk about Thomas Acord in a little bit. But this is someone that should have had should be like ushering in a movement here, but Doug Wilson's basically said Christian nationalism has to be what I want it to mean, or it's not, or I'm going to destroy it and it's not going to mean anything at all. But by the way, I'm still going to publish Stephen Wolf's book.
And it's important to know that Auron, and again, we could always talk about this later, but I'll lay it out right now. Auron's probably not well versed on every piece of drama that's happening in Christian Twitter on the online right. He's not aware of all. He's probably not even aware of how Doug Wilson went to war with Right Response Ministries, with Apologia.
I think he is aware by it.
Maybe tangentially, but he's probably not intimately aware of that. He's probably mildly aware of the whole Antioch Declaration and its specifics.
You're meaning he doesn't know all about the Tobias Riemenschneider thing?
He probably does not.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. I think he definitely knows that there's beef. Yes. But I don't think he knows about. He might not know about Tobias.
He's probably.
And by the way, what happened to him? Did his computer die again?
Yeah, but he's probably also not aware of I mean, he's probably got some knowledge on Stonequire, but as far as the debate between Stonequire and White, he probably did not catch that and was probably in transit during a lot of that aftermath. So,
all right, let's dive in.
Patriot Front, guys. Now, when the establishment is trying to discredit the right, and they do these psyops and they do these false flag operations, what do they act like? who do they act like? What do they mimic? So if I look at somebody in my X feed and I can't tell if this guy's a racist or an FBI agent, right? If he were FBI, would he be behaving any differently? And the answer is no, because this is a subversive, undermining movement trying to split up and balkanize the coalition that's come together to oppose the progressive secular left. And they've taken some real damage in the last few years, and I want to keep that up. I want them to continue to be beaten from the field. But in every war, there are the countermeasures that come against you, the troops that come against you, and then there are the subversives, the spies, the people who are trying to foment trouble on the inside. We are now big enough that the FBI has infiltrated what we're about doing. We know that they try to mimic the extreme elements of the right. Well, why do they do that? Because that kind of thing helps them. That's what it boils down to. And I'm with you that the real threat is the statist secular government. That the real threat is the total state. That's the threat. And the guys on our side who are misbehaving are not the real threat, except insofar as they are undermining our ability to fight the real threat. So that would be my general reaction.
Your thoughts on that? Because actually, let's first talk about the Patriot Front. I've had changing views on them. I actually think they're legit now. Like, I used to kind of think, oh, okay, they're just kind of feds, but I'm actually more or less thinking, okay, I don't think they're feds at all. But because even if they were feds,
I mean, you could argue
that would have been ended under the Trump administration.
I mean, you could argue whether there's efficacy to their tactics, which, I mean, again, that's debatable. I would probably lean towards they're not necessarily very effective, but at the same time, you know, they are. Yeah, I mean, I've had conversations. Obviously there might be feds that have infiltrated them, but they're not doing anything illegal for the most part, other than at the most vague trespassing, which, you know, neither here nor there, not really a prosecuted offense. But yeah, I mean, conversations I've had, they're just a bunch of more martial dudes that are, you know, they do jujitsu on the side, things like that, very masculine tribes. And at the end of the day, I mean, I'm not against the idea of like paramilitary LARPing, even if that, you know, even if it's just a LARP at this point, because, you know, people do Second Amendment LARPing all the time. And yeah, but this is overall just the same exact tactic as James Lindsay saying everything is a psyop. Don't trust anyone that's actually trying to do anything. And that's what it is. It's everything's a psyop is just a demoralization strategy. And then he kind of tries to thread that with they're a federal agent on Twitter or whatever, which, I mean, again, if you're talking about Nick Fuentes, just say you're talking about Nick Fuentes. But since you're not, that probably means you want to rope a lot more people into that. And with regards to Fuentes specifically, he's on tape saying to storm the Capitol on January 6th. So there's a huge piece of evidence of why this guy isn't prosecuted.
Yeah, I mean, Fuentes is interesting because he kind of ropes people to, you know, you'd think they'd be like white supremacists, but a lot of his audience really isn't white. And then he ropes himself to Kanye West. And despite the fact that Kanye West has changed his position multiple times on severe matters in the last 2 years, I mean, really his entire 2019 onward, he's been flip-flopping like crazy. But
one might say bipolar.
Yeah, you might say bipolar. But and then there's, you know, some people that are, you know, trying to maintain that level of influence. I mean, I think when you hit your wagon to Kanye West, you know, that's just a dumb strategy altogether. But that would be more like Fed behavior if you're trying to subvert a movement. Like, oh, let's hitch our wagon to Kanye West because
I mean,
I'm not really an MK Ultra guy, but that guy kind of seems like he's an MK Ultra guy.
I mean, again, with regards to Fuentes, he's someone that's allowed to exist because there's enough evidence that he could have been prosecuted and should have in theory, if you were being consistent with the other J6 prosecutions. But I mean, again, he's obviously trying to broad brush an entire group of people that he doesn't even know anything about as as feds simply because they're saying something weird on the internet.
Although they might be kinist, which is something that he'll go after later. But I found this rant to be incoherent. I thought this was the place that we should start.
Yeah, and that's fair. I guess my main concern is that in many ways, of course, again, I have no problem with just okay, don't act like that. That's sinful behavior. That's not something a Christian should be involved in. A perfectly fair response to I think a lot of that which is going on. But it feels like a lot of the time that is being spent is actually turning these guys into leaders more than it is removing their leadership. So I'll just throw this example out here. I had no idea who Stone Choir was until a bunch of guys who oppose Stone Choir told me. I literally did not know who these guys did. I had never heard a single one of their podcasts. I still haven't heard any of their podcasts, but I know who they are now. And I know a lot of guys who now are paying a lot more attention to them. And the only reason that they know who they are, or they're paying any attention to these guys or see them of any kind of notoriety, is that you guys can't start arguing with them. You can't start giving them air. And so you understand their trolling is working. Like their strategy is working on you. You're not defeating them. You're not removing them from power. Nick Fuentes doesn't like me, right? He spends a lot of time insulting me. I don't care. I don't spend a lot of time on Nick Fuentes. I'm doing shows on Nick Fuentes. I don't go around trying to get in debates with Nick Fuentes. Nick Fuentes is something I don't think about. I know he's out there. I know people tell me, they send me something. Oh, Nick Fuentes said something about you. Cool, great, whatever. I don't care. I got more important problems right now. I'm sure he has an audience, but that's just not my major concern. And by getting in debates with him online, by like trying to attack him, I would just be feeding that, right? Like that's very obviously what he's looking for. And so I guess what I'm saying is, while I understand, especially one-on-one, like if you see a young man in your church or someone you know personally, you can turn to that guy as someone who has authority in his life, as a Christian brother, and especially if you're someone who's in a place of authority, you can turn to him and say, these are not people you should be following. This is not behavior you should be engaging in. And you'll have real authority because that's how actual masculine discipleship works. Right. But when you're online, just being like, don't talk to people like that, you sound like a hectoring grandma. Like you sound like a woke, blue-haired progressive person. If you're longhousing people. And I think that's the real problem with engaging in this way. It's not that what you're saying is wrong. It's not that these rebukes don't ultimately hold value or that they shouldn't be engaged in. But I think the very model of like mass attempts to hector people into a particular style, especially when you have no authority over them, like no direct actual personal authority over them, it just ends up creating this scenario where a lot of people get, they get drawn to these people more than they get pushed away.
So, Auron MacIntyre is basically saying that they punched down on Stone Choir, elevated their position in a Streisand effect sort of way.
Well, it might even be worse than that because it's always worse than, that the obvious explanation. And in this case, they validated Stone Choir in the way that they attacked him, similar to how a lot of people are bashing Andrew Tate, but they're not doing it in a way that's like actually the real reason Andrew Tate's a problem. But they're actually doing it in a way that he says mean things about women, so we got to attack him. And that validates the statements about women that Andrew Tate actually makes. So when you attack Stone Choir, you're actually validating their very logic and a lot of their arguments by attacking them. And the same way, a lot of people that are attacking Andrew Tate, like, we can talk about Joel Berry, talk and all these dudes that'll blame men for the abortion problem in America. And it's the same thing. They don't want to blame women for the problems that are directly the result of women. They said blame men. And then that's the reason like Andrew Tate gets ascendancy. Same thing with a lot of like Stone Choir, their arguments, because a lot of these people don't want to actually address race problems in America, don't actually want to address that white people should have a collective interest. See that word, that C word, collectivism. Now it's the real C word. And Doug Wilson is kind of one of those. And
but we're going to get into Doug Wilson's inconsistent views on that.
Yeah, we'll get that. We'll get there. But that is a thing that will drive more people to Stone Choir. Because, again, at the end of the day, they're validating Stone Choir's arguments.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's punching down is a stupid idea. I don't really punch down on this channel. Even if I go after someone like James Lindsay or Joel Berry, they still got hundreds of thousands of followers between them. So that's really punching up. And Babylon Bee is like a powerful media complex. So not really punching down there. But, I wrote about this earlier in the month, probably. I think it was earlier in the month. Yeah, on the 11th, about low cows got to get milked. Because that's what I wrote about, milking the low cows. Because you got to turn certain people into jokes. But that's much different than punching down and trying to cancel people for association, which I do believe is what's about to get brought up by Auron right here.
Yeah, I think that first, your point is in principle quite correct. And I try to follow it. When someone attacks me online, one of my routine procedures is I check their profile. And if it's just a handful of followers, if I respond to them, I've just made their day.
Right.
Right. And I don't, they're being foolish or moronic, and I don't want to make their day, because if I give them oxygen, if I give them airtime, I've made their day. But if I click on something and they've got 150,000 followers, they've just made my day. Right? Because I don't want to give know nothings. I don't want to give mayflies the microphone and make their day. And at the same time, I don't mind when bad guys give me the microphone and I've got an opportunity to speak to a big chunk of their audience. So I take your point about we don't want to make Stone Choir a thing. We don't want to do that. That's not what the intention was. I'll just say this. A number of us are not just commenting online. We're not just commenting on X or posting online. I'm a pastor, and I'm a pastor of a conservative evangelical church. And our network of pastors has been having to deal with misbehaving anons in their churches, and young men who are attracted to this sort of thing. And in Moscow, we've had numerous conversations with young men in our congregation seeking to address these things. And I can assure you that Stone Choir was enough of a thing to make a big mess. And at some point, you have to, and the judgment call may have been wrong. We may have misplaced the judgment. But at some point, you have to follow the Pauline admonition to rebuke the gainsayer, to rebuke the person, to debate him and shut him down, and say, okay, this needs to be for one and done. And I think that James White's debate with Corey Mahler was quite effective. And the blog post that I did, the follow-up blog post on Stone Choir, took off like a rocket. Lots and lots of people read it. And I'm hoping that we can spike those guns. I don't want to just keep them alive. I don't want to keep them going and make them a thing. But we addressed them because they were already becoming a thing and causing pastoral problems in our circles. And it looked like if you don't say anything, you're sort of ceding the field. You're granting the legitimacy of the point. And I don't want to be in that position either. So it's a judgment call. I agree with you. You don't want to feed the trolls. Don't feed the trolls. That's a good rule. But at the same time, if the troll is in the village eating people, you got to do something.
I get.
So he kind of talks about struggle sessioning people.
Yeah,
who
he's literally talking about
listened or interacted with people, or who operate anonymously online.
Yeah,
that's what he's talking about here.
How would you know if someone in your congregation operates, anonymously, unless you were confronting them about it, or maybe doing a broad brush? You're having a men's group and you just bring it up in conversation that anonymous activity online is inherently wrong and sinful, blah blah blah, that all these people are saying.
Now he's also talking about his circles, so this might not just be his church. I have heard accounts that Doug Wilson's actually pretty hands-off. He's very grandfatherly as a pastor of a local church. That's my understanding of how, and that's a compliment, by the way. The person who told me this was complimenting this. But I also hear that, people in Christchurch, Moscow, they don't necessarily agree with the direction of, the Antioch Declaration crowd, because at the end of the day, they didn't
sign the paper.
They didn't sign it. Most of his elders didn't sign it. Most of his church members didn't sign it. So clearly, Doug Wilson's out on a limb on these issues even within his own church. And, people like James White are James White is actively calling for people to get doxxed and stuff like that for being anonymous.
I mean, again, I've met people that listen to Stone Choir. I personally don't, even though I kind of follow them. But at the end of the day, the people that listen to Stone Choir aren't religiously being like, oh, what they say is gospel. I believe everything and anything that they say, or I take everything they say 100%. They understand who Stone Choir is. They listen to them. They listen to them just as they listen to other sources. And, there's cross-pollination with that audience, even Auron MacIntyre's audience, even, other, popular people in our circles. Their audiences overlap with Stone Choirs. And at the end of the day, it's just one of several things that they listen to. And it's not like they put out a daily show. They put out a podcast every
once a
so
week,
often.
I
Yeah.
guess.
So
And after they took a big break.
yeah, they'll listen to them, but it's not like it's the number one influence in their life, and there's nothing wrong with listening to them. As far as a past, as Joel Webben said, he doesn't have the authority to say that you can't watch it.
Right. And Doug Wilson kind of said that he would exercise such an authority, the way he talks about that. But I hear that he's not like that as a pastor. So let's move on to the next part.
Yes, I'll just put my cards on the table here. I'm good friends with Ryan Turnipseed, who was excommunicated from his church because he went on Stonequire's podcast. Now, Ryan doesn't agree with everything they say at all. He was simply invited on a podcast about an issue. He discussed it and left. But this was enough to get him full church discipline, several struggle sessions, total lies from church leadership. Ryan is one of the most upstanding young men I have ever seen. He is a leader. He's a good man. The fact that a guy like him can be excommunicated simply for speaking with these people and not immediately like caving to some kind of mob denouncement of them does not speak well of the process. It reminds me a lot of the Thomas Acord affair. I've met Rob Dreher. He likes my stuff. Seems like a nice enough guy. He also was involved in a cancellation that canceled one of my friends, who's a very good guy, not Thomas Acord, but one of the other guys at that school, who's a very good guy with several children who he suddenly couldn't feed because of this witch hunt. And so I'm very concerned that several of my personal friends who are good Christian men, family men, people of upstanding character, are being slandered and destroyed in this like witch hunt over what seems like a relatively small batch of guys who, again, fair enough, bad behavior is bad behavior. I'm willing to call it out and I'm willing to acknowledge it. And I think that there's obviously a role of that, especially if you're a pastor. But do we have to turn this into a public struggle session, or can we just address bad behavior in our churches? I guess I'm confused about that fact.
Well, I would say you've come to the right person, because Rod Dreher has gone after me also. So I know that there are not only is there bad behavior on the right that needs to be disciplined, there's bad behavior on the right in conducting the discipline.
Yes, very much so. Yeah.
Right. So I know that and acknowledge that. I would have to I don't know the particulars of those cases, but I do know that Rod Dreher, very ironically, wrote a very good book, Live Not by Lies. I really liked the book, but was pretty responsible for circulating a number of lies about us. And you can't write a book called Live Not by Lies and then circulate lies, right? So, okay, that's no fun. That's no good. We don't want to do that. So having said that, people are sinners and they sin everywhere they go. They sin in being right wing. They sin in being hardcore. They sin and fail when they try to crack down on people who are sinning and being hardcore. I agree with you. We shouldn't do bad things. We should do good things. Yeah, I agree.
Fair enough.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because Doug Wilson flat out lied there.
Yeah, I mean,
we got to call this out. Doug Wilson flat out lied there about Thomas Acord, and he tried to equivocate by saying, "Oh, Rod Dreher went after us too." No, you went after Thomas Acord, Doug. You went after him at the time, and then you lie about not knowing the particular details of the case. No, you did an entire video on this. And I get it. It's 2-3 years ago, so you've forgotten. You're old. Memory goes when you're old. I'm not trying to be derogatory towards an elder here. I'm just saying I'm giving the innocent explanation for why he's lying here. And he lied there because he said that it was no tragedy what happened to Thomas Acord, that it was a just outcome.
No, we have the clip, right?
I don't have the clip ready, but that's what was going, because then it bleeds into like what that. So I don't have the isolated clip. So if you wanted to pull it up real quick, you can do that. But he basically said it was not an injustice what happened to Thomas Acord. Those were his words. No, it was an injustice what happened to him. He said some funny things. He shouldn't have lied about saying funny things. But he said some funny things, and he should not have been canceled for saying funny things. He should not be canceled for comedy in this country.
And again, I've met Turnipseed, great guy in person, stand-up guy. So yeah, and again, Auron's basically insinuating that if you're disciplining someone over Stonequire, we know that it's not going to be biblical. We know that you're basically trying to ruin their life. Like he knows how the discipline would actually work if a church actually tried to do it.
All right, I got the clip.
And again,
we accept the fact that people ought not to be writing vile Kinnis tweets under a pseudonym. We agree that such a person should not be the headmaster of a classical Christian school. If Thomas Acord now has to get a job driving a FedEx truck, we feel bad for him and his family, but we believe that no foundational injustice has been done to him. He set himself up for this, in other words. We are willing to play by the rules, provided they are rules of basic decency and are evenly applied.
Yeah. So right from the horse's mouth.
And keep in mind that when they were going after right response of the person in their church, that was a father with kids that they were going after. They don't care about the consequences of their actions. They don't care about the fact that they could be attacking someone and depriving them of income for their family. They don't care.
And over what? Funny tweets? Like saying, was it? He made some funny tweets. So anyway, so Doug Wilson lied there, needs to be called out.
We have a lot of super chats stacking up, and I don't know if we're going to be able to get to all of them, so I will do my best, but I can't keep Pastor Wilson here forever. So just letting you know, I'm going to get into our last topic before we go to the questions of the people. But if you're worried about getting your question read, you may want to stop with super chats just because we have so many, and I don't know if we're going to have time to get to all of them. I don't want anyone putting in a super chat and not getting their chance. So Pastor Wilson, my last question is this: you mentioned the Nietzscheans, and don't get me wrong, I was dunking on a neo-pagan on Twitter today. So I'm more than fine to make sport of these people when they're saying ridiculous things about Christianity. That said, you look at something like the Spanish Civil War, and the right Republicans and the Carlists and the Phalangists, they have very big differences, right? Like they have pretty big ideological differences, but they know they don't want to get murdered by the Bolsheviks. And so even though maybe the Phalangists aren't the best guys, they still get to march in their uniforms, and they still kill an awful lot of the bad guys, right? And then you don't end up with a communist revolution in Spain. And so I understand that ultimately, like me and like Bronze Age pervert are going to have some pretty big differences at the end of the day on a number of issues. And I think it's entirely reasonable to acknowledge those. I do on a regular basis. Like I said, I got no problem, going after a pagan when they're attacking Christianity. Do it all the time. That said, at the end of the day, coalitions are coalitions, and co-belligerents are co-belligerents. And the point, I think, ultimately of no enemies on the right is I'll put it pretty bluntly, we're on the edge of what could be a complete systemic failure of American government. Like we got pretty close. If Kamala Harris had been able to eke out that victory, I don't know which of us would not be in jail at this moment. Like I say that without, I think, any level of hyperbole. They literally tried to murder the president on live television. So I think I'm pretty safe in saying this. When we're at that level, I feel like we'll win and then figure it out is actually a pretty reasonable response to a lot of what's going on right now. Not to say that any of this behavior is acceptable, not to say that personally you can't deal with it as you should. Obviously, again, if you're a pastor or someone in a position of leadership, you should be speaking truth, especially Christ's truth into the lives of all the people who are under you, including truths about hatred. But ultimately, like, the winning is the most important part at this point, because if we don't win, then we don't get another chance to actually speak God's truth, at least not without going to jail or getting shot. And so I think you're not going to find me being the best buds at the end of the day with some of these guys. I feel like sometimes you got to make the coalition to win. And I guess I'll just kind of hang that out there for your response.
Yeah, up to a point, I agree with that. So, for example, if we gathered up all the people on the right that we've been talking about this whole time, I would venture to say that 90% of all of us voted the same way in this last election. Right? I am more than willing to be in a generic cultural.
What's the other 10%?
I don't even know.
Like not voting, or not voting for Trump specifically?
I just
that other 10%. Voting for Kanye West?
I just assume he's saying that an overwhelming majority, but not 100%. I mean, but again,
like 1 in 10 is a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's some vague appeal to majoritarianism, which I didn't quite register it as significant. But I mean, the overall point on the Spanish Civil War is rather poignant, and obviously you can tell that Auron MacIntyre was at the OGC conference, for those that know, because there was a speech regarding the Spanish Civil War, and it was basically about exactly what he just said. That in a brief speech on a very complex issue, the reason that the nationalists won is because they teamed up against the Bolsheviks despite their various differences. And yes, the right is going to have quite a few different camps. They're going to have the tech bros of Elon Musk and some of their interests. They're going to have the more MAGA traditionalists, They're going to have these, your more or less your white evangelicals, hashtag lone bulwark. They're going to have a lot of these various factions. And then they need to find ways to appeal to the factions that they need to have in order to maximize electoral turnout. But at the end of the day, they can't be infighting against themselves unless they just want to suffer and die. Like, again, that's what the Never Trumpers, a lot of them want to do that, especially those that are more the neocons, the Mitt Romney types. They would rather lose than have Trump win. They would rather, or the James Lindsay types that would rather live under communism than under Christian nationalism.
Yeah. And they're very clear that they will side, the liberals will side with the communists before they side with you.
And again, if the right wants to win, they have to stop infighting. And a lot of times the Christians are exactly like conservative politics. They love their infighting. They can't get enough of it. They love just having divisions over stupid issues. They love making the the Protestant Catholic debates and all that, that anti-Catholic slop apologetics.
The slop accounts. Your farm girl
we have
movies.
far more pressing issues to deal with in the, whether Catholics are the same as us and where the line is. Which, I mean, we can have those as far as in-person conversations, but we don't need to do slop.
It's not the number 2 issue. It's not
important for slop apologetics.
Right. But that gets a lot of clicks, a lot of views, a lot of engagement farm to be farmed.
And again, we don't need to
continue because we got we still got some scream go.
Movement that includes wildly disparate types of people. And I have a blog post I wrote a year or two ago on the Jesus mobs. With the mobs in Jerusalem at the time of the Lord, there were people who were baptized by John the Baptist. But notice how the bad guys, the establishment bad guys, have to tiptoe around Jerusalem. Why? Because they were afraid of the mobs, right? And when the apostles are arrested and detained in the book of Acts, they were afraid of being stoned. So they were very, very polite when they took the apostles in. Well, it's very clear from that the mobs, the crowds out there, had not really internalized the Sermon on the Mount yet. They were on Jesus' side, but they had all kinds of raggedy opinions. And Jesus calls for his disciples. He calls one of them is Levi, the tax collector, a collaborator with the Roman government, and he also calls Simon the Zealot, a hard right guy in our terms, and he calls them to be his disciples, to be among his disciples. So I agree that. Basically, Franco winning. Someone mentioned an American Franco. What people don't understand is we're not sitting in a seminar room wishing what's the ideal form of government. Maybe God would send us a Franco from heaven, and we could live under that kind of government. You have to realize that you're dealing with the options that are on the table. And in Spain, it was the commies, or it was this hard-bitten right-wing coalition, and it was a blessing that Franco won. But that doesn't mean I sit back and think that Franco's the ideal.
Of course, right.
I don't think he's the ideal at all. I would much prefer to restore the American constitutional order. That's what I want.
Can I just interject to say, why can't you say that, hey, Franco was a good guy? I honestly don't know why. So let's get into my let's get into my criticisms of Catholicism. Why is Francisco Franco not sainted? And Joan of Arc is sainted. That makes no sense because, first of all, Joan of Arc, kind of a proto-feminist in my opinion, was only, the Catholic Church said, no, she was to die, and then they changed their mind on it centuries later, and then they canonized her.
I side with the British.
Which the timeline of her being canonized does coincide with feminism's rise in society. So I don't think you get canonized Joan of Arc without feminism.
Well, I mean, canonization has been.
And then Francisco Franco saved Catholicism in Spain, was a defender of the faith. But I know the Catholic Church does not like canonizing rulers anymore, like they used to. But they don't like to do it to kings and stuff like that. But I don't understand. Catholicism has been feminized. That's my criticism of Catholicism. It's been feminized. And you celebrate Joan of Arc, but you don't celebrate Francisco Franco, who's the last great defender of the faith that you guys have. So, but I don't know why you can't say, hey, we don't have to talk about the 100% ideal. We can just say, hey, this leader that we had was a Christian prince. He was competent. He had the best interest of a nation in mind. Instead, anytime you see that, anytime you see competence in a leader that's not an American, but America's got to be like, oh, well, they're a bad guy. But you know, they're doing their thing.
Their mustache, man. They're
Well, even like Vladimir Putin, like he's the best thing Russia's had in, I don't know, 200 years.
Well, again,
maybe?
you're not going to get effective leadership in democracy. It just doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
Even if we go with Bukele, who technically, you know, he arose through the political left in El Salvador, but obviously,
who was the most competent leader in Europe over COVID? Lukashenko.
Dictator. Yeah, I mean, again, even the great presidents that are commonly perceived were more authoritarian in their exercise of the office, and even for good and bad. But I mean, again, and Doug Wilson basically tries to, you can constitution your way to a better country. And the problem is that the Constitution actually worked, we wouldn't be in this mess. And the other problem is that the Constitution as written and with the original franchise could work, even in the country as it is currently is. But the problem is we amended the Constitution.
Yeah.
And we
the other thing, the point is, we don't really have a Constitution. We have what 9 people say is a Constitution. Yeah. Until we start defying the Supreme Court, they are the Constitution now.
Yeah, I mean, again,
and they don't have the sword and they don't have the purse to enforce their law. But yet we don't challenge that.
Yeah, but that's Carl Schmitt.
I'm goading you, Trump.
That's Carl
the Supreme
Schmitt, though.
Court. Give us a Constitution again.
That's Carl Schmitt. That's woke right. You know, he who decides the exception is the sovereign, as he would say.
Right, so, and that is what the Supreme Court did. They gave themselves more power, and that's what Supreme Courts are doing everywhere in the world. Romania, they just said, "Hey, this election's invalid." Why? Don't know. NATO. Well, NATO told us it was invalid, so they invalidated their Supreme Court, invalidated an entire election. Brazil's Supreme Court, just decided Bolsonaro, whatever his name is, can't run for office or whatever. So, yes.
And again, if
we don't have constitutions,
if Auron MacIntyre really wants to be confrontational, I mean, he could devour Wilson on this point. But again, he is being very friendly, much more diplomatic, letting his arguments fall flat on their own merit, which I think they do, because Auron MacIntyre has an intelligent audience.
Right.
And I'm not just self-aggrandizing myself.
Yeah, I think he's one of the brightest thinkers on the right now.
But if we keep up with this nonsense of the progressive push, we're going to wind up with a Franco. Or if we lose, worse.
Right. Yeah. Unfortunately, Franco is the good outcome if things get bad enough. And the point being is, even an attempt to restore the American Constitution would require, honestly, frankly, a revolution at this point. Like that's kind of where we're at, is that just suggesting constitutional government seems revolutionary to these people. Just having a functioning executive branch that actually operates as Article 2 dictates has people calling Trump Hitler, right? And a fascist. So I think that ultimately just a functioning constitutional government with something like, say, freedom of association is something that is so radical that most people would think of it as hard right at this point. And so that's why I tend to take the view that ultimately we have to win. And again, that doesn't mean that anything goes, and it doesn't mean that we can't chastise poor behavior, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be discipling young men to turn away from particular behaviors that we think are destructive to them overall. I guess ultimately the point is just you have to have the eye on the prize. You have to have the big picture here, and the big picture is the hour is late, and if you want peaceful solutions, the reason you get Francos is always that the moderate right wingers didn't do their job. Right. This is always why you get Franco, because the guys ahead of Franco wouldn't do the job. And so it took a Franco to get it done. And so if we are going to cower, if we're not going to address these issues, if we're going to play it safe, if we're going to shy away, if we're going to get scared from all the bad men along the way to get done what needs to get done, so we don't end up in a position of needing a Franco, well, then we're just driving ourselves to the same destination. Right.
Agreed.
All right, guys. Well, we're going to head to the question of the people. Like I said, we might not get through all these because we're already almost up to an hour, but we'll do our best. Before we start taking questions, Pastor Wilson, is there anywhere you want people to check? Any new books coming out that you want to make people aware of? Yes, and maybe very good. All right, guys, let's go to the questions here. Creeper Weirdo says, Doug, I love blog and Mayblog. It really helps me see things from the Christian perspective. Also, Auron, you're welcome for the guest suggestion. Yes, thank you very much, sir. Robert Weinsfield says, Auron has been listening.
Wow. Was that a troll? Like, I love Creeper Weirdo saying that he loved Doug Wilson. Was that a troll? You're muted.
I don't know, but I mean that is a regular live streamer with
Okay.
with
I'm wondering whether that was like, hey, you name yourself Creeper Wielder. I love this guy. Yeah, it doesn't really not the best.
I mean that's a regular contributor, so I don't know what more to say.
But too busy. Oh, sorry. Auron, been listening, but too busy to listen live recently. Appreciate both your work. One of the few Jews who believes that the USA needs Christian nationalism. Netter means no enemies, not no disagreements. Here, we have Perspicacious Heretic. He says, is it time to drop the term woke altogether? Even when applied to the left, it seems to have become nebulous. Yeah, and this is
okay. This is a more substantive super chat.
Well, let me just go.
That's why we wanted to cover this section, because there's some substance on this back end here.
Yes, and this is where you perhaps get Auron being most, I guess, confrontational and most argumentative with Doug Wilson, and his harshest pushback comes in the super chat section. But let me just go back to that second where Auron talks about, the reason we get Francos is because the dudes that are in power don't do their jobs. As the prophet Nathan said to David, "Thou art that man." And Doug Wilson is the guy who is going to be responsible for the Franco arising. Same with James White. Same with the people in the Southern Baptist Convention. Like, you are the people that are going to give way to a Franco. And again, the Republican Party is the reason that we have a Donald Trump and the reason we need a Donald Trump. Otherwise, the party would just go back to where it was.
Yeah.
So, thou art the man.
I mean, I think in 2016, 70% of Republicans voted against the establishment. So maybe, but it was probably for the best that it went in the Trump direction long term.
Actually my problem. I think the end of Neil Shimvey and James Lindsay's effort is going to be to just make woke no longer an effective weapon against the left. I think that's actually going to be the end point of abusing the term as we have seen it.
That's a good point.
Kruber Weirdo says,
why does he use
fascism?
woke right?
Okay, define fascism. Silence. Well, yeah, obviously that's a much larger problem. I've gone into Paul Godfrey's work on what fascism actually is. If you would like to go to that podcast, I did about an hour on that. But obviously the abuse of that term has made it as useless as many of the other pejoratives that have been thrown at us.
Agreed.
Johan Richardson says, when the oppressed desire remedy is to be left alone, their complaints are less suspect when the oppressed demand as some financial reparations. Yes, I agree, actually. So this is critical. And this is why, like I said, that's why I really disagree with Lindsay and Shinvey and others labeling people who are pointing out anti-white hatred as being woke, because the answer to anti-white hatred is to get rid of anti-white laws and attitudes and things like corporations. I'm not looking for specific special honor treatment. I'm looking for affirmative action, but for white dudes because they were held out. Again, just asking for equal weights and measures. And I think that's probably the most important difference when we look at, rather than just oppressor and oppress. Okay, what are you actually asking for? And if the answer is special carve-outs in perpetuity, then you're probably closer to the woke side than those who are just simply asking for the removal of abusive laws.
Yes, what fixes this?
Yes, right. Let's see here. Broman Hank says, it was a rather surreal to watch my country's president like he was grilled in a headmaster's office.
Is this part relevant? Because I'd like to skip ahead.
The next question. I actually like the idea of having the South Africa president being grilled in the White House as like a question that's right before this question, because of how it flows together.
This is the question.
But yeah,
Lindsay and Shinvey are adopting the framing and weapons of the left. Why doesn't he call for the people to disassociate for them as he has for Isker and Webben? And yeah, like I said, that was kind of my question as well. Why are guys?
So this question directly calls out Doug Wilson.
Yeah, but this is also where I'm not sure Auron understands the entire context of what happens on Christian Twitter. That's why I made that comment earlier. I believe someone in the chat might have corrected me. He did actually address the Antioch Declaration with a more, I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed. But I mean, as far as him knowing the intimate details of, why Isker doesn't have a home in Moscow, which is something he said with regards to the Ogden.
No, I think it was, if you go with Isker, you won't have a home in Moscow.
Yes, it was that comment. And that was in regards to his
Joel Webben doing
his series with Joel Webben on the Jays. And then, of course, Ogden as well could also be thrown in there.
Yeah.
Like that, the Babylon Bee getting a pass at this, or TPUSA getting a pass on this, but everybody has to denounce, all these other guys.
Yeah, I've gone after Shenby before, and so I don't have any problem with saying call out problems wherever you see them. And basically, there's a tendency to notice when someone is critiquing someone who's maybe closer to you or someone who has your sympathies. But
Sure.
I really do believe that we ought to be even-handed on this. And I don't think Neil Shenby is compromised because of his friendship with J.D. Greer and what he's carrying water for. All the analysis that he offered, when it came down to where it counted in his own church, he wasn't able to see it. So for another example of this, or wasn't willing to say something about it. Another example.
Okay, I got to call that out too. That's cap as well.
Well, I mean,
Neil Shenby's compromised because he's a liar.
Well,
Like, Neil Shenby's not. Oh, I'm really committed to fighting wokeness. Oh, and I just can't see it in my own church. Oh, shucks. No, that's not Neil Shenby at all. Neil Shenby is actively subversive. He's being propped up because he's actively subversive. He defended Resolution 9 at the time and then lies about being against wokeness, against critical race theory. You supported it. You supported Resolution 9. You support female pastors. You say you don't, but you go to a church that actively sent messengers to the Southern Baptist Convention who presumably voted along with the head pastor against banning female pastors in the Southern Baptist Convention. You tied to that church. So obviously what you say doesn't matter. I don't care what Neil Shenby says. Look at what he does.
He's also fundamentally anti-white.
He is anti-white, yeah. So, and
again, you'll see that later on when they get to it, that Doug Wilson's answer sounds exactly like Neil Shenby's answer with Dave Green. And if you're expecting an answer on Webben and Isker in this question, don't. And
yeah,
that was the major omission in this question. And Auron does not press him on this. Maybe that's a critique, but obviously I think there's, I won't say ignorance of the subject matter being asked about, but obviously, Doug Wilson's omission of those two names in his response is telling in and of itself, because he talks only about Neil Shenby, not about who he's compared to.
And he gives the most charitable read of Neil Shenby that he does not extend to people like Stonechoir. Why don't they get the charitable read? Why do you act like your opponents have daddy issues and then you go out and defend Neil Shenby, who I don't think works for a living, but I could be wrong about that. But
because
why do you defend Neil Shenby?
Because white people are their own outgroup.
Yeah.
To quote Stephen Wolf.
So he defends Neil Shenby right here, but then you go after Stonechoir, their followers. You mischaracterize your enemies or people that don't like you, people that oppose the Antioch Declaration, which he wants as he wants that to be a test of orthodoxy, ultimately. And it's luckily failed at being that, but that was the threat level. So I think associating with Neil Shenby, final point on Neil Shenby, associating with Neil Shenby and Joel Berry, who works for a company that hired hired someone who sold a certain pornography, that is way more egregious than listening to a Stonechoir episode. If we want to play guilt by association, I'll talk about Steve Dace for a second. You think that Michael Spengler is bad? You've had Dave Rubin, a human trafficker, on your show.
No, but he didn't.
Example of this was Carl Trueman in his Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. That was a marvelous book, wonderful book.
It was,
and I was astounded that Carl Trueman could see all those things so accurately and not see what was going on with Amy Bird in his very own podcast. Friendships and personal connections.
Again, maybe Carl Trueman was overrated at the time.
I mean, I think John Harris did a review of his book. I mean, Carl Trueman is a liberal through and through. And I think he's British, and that might be part of it, that he has that foreigner liberalism kind of embedded in him. But yeah, I mean, but Wilson is kind of right on this. It's just like, oh, you're all this, but you work with Amy Bird, which is why I disregard anything.
But I agree with the questioner that we really need to be even-handed about this.
Fair enough. Elijah Timon says, to Wilson, by what reasonable mechanism and strategy would you prevent Black Americans from basing their solidarity on shared racial backgrounds?
Okay, I don't have any objection to them basing actions on shared tribal background. But
Okay.
I think that the Bible speaks a lot in terms of tribes. I
Mhm.
think that the Navajo are a tribe. Blacks in America, American blacks, are a more inchoate tribe with a distinct subculture within America. But I think that the biblical term ethnos can be reasonably applied to American. I want to fight for the American tribal identity, and that tribal identity is more cosmopolitan than the tribal identity of Japan is. So
Sure.
Japan or northern Finland is more ethnically thoroughbred than what we've got. Sort of it's not a melting
Don't
pot.
say the melting pot. No.
I was going to say, I'm not going to say the melting pot. It's more like a chef salad. All the disparate elements are in there, but it's a thing in itself. So when I meet a conservative Black American businessman, one of the things I'm
That's a
struck by
rarity.
is how thoroughly American he is. And the fact that if you just considered his skin color and dropped him off in sub-Saharan Africa, he'd be almost as out of place as I would be. And so consequently, I want to
comment on that for a second, because I know Anthony Bradley is a bit of a low-cal, because he made a comment about wanting to find a church that had interracial couples everywhere, but not white Asian, which I
No.
thought was absolutely
No,
hilarious.
yeah.
I'm going to write an article on that, because that was so funny to me. Like, he actually
The
said
art
that
of the
out loud.
ratio is hysterical. Now, keep in mind, he says
but
that Black people.
I had a point here.
Okay.
So he said that, Vodi Bakum said the same thing, that, he went to Africa. He was not African, and yes, there is something. People have reduced race to skin color, when race is a little deeper than skin color. It's more meaningful than skin color. So race is not skin deep. So broader point saying, I believe that it's very valid to say that American descendants of slavery, ADOS as an acronym that's used, is a legitimate race. It is, they have an ethnogenesis. They have there's an ethnogenesis there.
No,
And
keep in mind the word he
I
uses.
talked about that.
The word he
But-
uses is inchoate, which basically means like early, tentative, almost like primordial. It's just like, wow, they've been here for that long and they're still not like a cohesive tribe. Which, I mean, one might say that is itself a rather denigrating remark on Black people, that they can't even form a tribe after being more or less unified for 200 plus years. But
right, I actually say they would. They have.
Well, yeah, I would say that Black people have achieved ethnogenesis in the United States. Also, white people.
Their ethnogenesis is so distinct that they don't fit in Africa. That's the broader point. Vodi Bakum made that point in a different way. And, I think if you wanted to restart the Liberia project, I think that nation would thrive more than the other African nations around there. Not advocating for repatriation. I'm just saying, if you did what was that? The American Colonial Society, like, they formed groups trying to repatriate, slaves back in the 1800s and all. I think if they were to do that today, like, yeah, Black Americans would form a more competent nation. I think that's true.
Than what's already there?
Yes. I don't think if you gave, I think they could farm.
Well, I mean, let's. I mean, there's so much
like that.
There's so much to unpack. I mean, is America really more cosmopolitan than Japan?
Yeah.
Like,
how is it using the word cosmopolitan?
We are far more rural than Japan. Japan is very urban.
We have the cowboy stereotype. Like, how do you mix cowboy with Cosmo?
I mean, you live in Idaho.
He lives in a college town in Idaho, but
still, he can see some mountains if he, drove 20 minutes. But yeah, he lives in Idaho, and he's saying America's more cosmopolitan than Japan. And again, the chef's salad versus melting pot, which again both suck. And that also requires that the ingredients in the salad add value to the overall salad. Which if we're looking at which races pay taxes in the United States, one of them does. And
here's the thing:
two groups in particular that don't.
The Haitians.
Yes.
But
yeah, is that adding value to the chef salad, or are they like what's bad on a salad, like
olives?
I mean, reasonable. Let's be more absurd.
I'm naming foods I don't like. There's not a whole lot of foods I just grapefruit. There we go. That's That's a food I absolutely hate in all forms, especially if you sneak it into wine and don't label it as such.
But yeah, there are things you can add to a salad that detract from the salad. Is he going to acknowledge that, or do all the ingredients have to not, they have to be treated equally as if they add equal value, even though some ingredients actually detract from the community. Some groups are harmful; they're net drains on the tax base, and that's just one metric.
Yeah. Some cultures don't mix. So yeah, like Vivek Ramaswamy doesn't mix. Anyway,
I want to defend America as a tribal identity, and I think it's worth fighting for, worth preserving. And I think that the open borders policy was a deliberate attempt to destroy that. And I'm objecting to fragmentation within America. I mean, American blacks who've been here for 400 years are part of the picture. They're part of what makes us a people. And so I want to defend that. I don't want to, and I don't want to begrudge American blacks from acting in a quasi-tribal capacity. But what they ask for, what they look for, should be equal treatment. Leave us alone. They shouldn't be looking for reparations or affirmative action or anything like that.
Sure. So I'll say this, and I don't want to belabor it because we're already running late, but I fear we.
Now, keep in mind, he actually said that Doug Wilson actually believes that America can be itself in ethnicity, and the biblical ethnos can apply to America. I don't know if he says that coming up.
Does he say that white Americans and black Americans would be ethnically the same? I don't think that. I don't think that's the case.
That is going to be his argument, and you're going to
I think black Americans, yes, they're their own ethnicity, and I'm fine with that. Like, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah,
I think white Americans need to embrace the same thing.
Yeah, but again,
so I think, and then if you actually do that, I think you can actually have more racial harmony if you actually do it on.
Oh yeah, if you actually have, one might call it natural hierarchies. But at the end of the day, if white people consolidate around shared identity, then all the political problems more or less go away, except for financial system.
I did the
with the neoconservatism and warmongering, but a lot of your social contagions, like the gayness, that all goes away.
Yeah, I already did the electoral college map. If you convince white people to stop hating themselves, yeah, it'd be done. And that would benefit black people if the Democrat Party never achieved power again. They would benefit from that. So
we might have a case of Schrodinger's ethnicity here. The black ethnicity is real, but then there's a grander American ethnicity. So there has to be other real ethnicities in the United States at that point, right? The black ethnicity the ethnogenesis occurs for American blacks because they don't have roots to tribe or language after being separation. And so the shared ethnic trait of them is that the state they share.
I'll give you one.
Sure.
Instead of, I don't like saying there's this white tribal identity because I think that's almost worthless. But I don't think
so. There, he just said black people can have a collective identity, but white people can't.
Yeah, because again, that would mean that the white collective identity is too big and would essentially dwarf the black collective identity. Which, well, yeah, it's whose country is it? But yeah, because again, he can't allow white people to collectivize, because then that would mean that they can act in their own collective interest, and that would mean the other races don't get any say.
Yeah, I mean, it's an inconsistent argument. Like, it's not okay if white people do it, but it is okay if
that is their argument. And that's Neil Shenvi's
white people do it, which I don't see how that's worthless at all. You've seen what happens with wokeness. It's like, okay, the Black Lives Matter movement was united and then just was able to punch through all of culture. It's kind of like that scene in that famous scene in Game of Thrones where Robert Baratheon asked, what's stronger, 5 or 1? And he said 1 because the fist is larger than the fingers, is the analogy that I was using. So 1 united force is stronger than 5 larger even armies. Divide and conquer, so to speak. That basic military tactic, defeat in detail. So, and look what happened when Black Lives Matter reigned over the United States. It was terrible.
Well, okay,
what happened when we had Mamala as a vice president of the United States and almost became president?
Okay, come on now. We can just go to anywhere where black people have ruled over white people, and it has been a disaster for the white people.
And
beginning with Haiti, South Africa, Rhodesia, Basically, the countries that the Portuguese got kicked out of Africa, any other country with uprising that the British gave up, like every case where white people turned over power to the non-whites, it was a disaster for the white people.
Decolonization was a disaster for the world. It even created the
Again,
modern
it was
Israel-Palestine conflict.
it was also a disaster for the black people too, for them to have power. So again, pick an example.
Right.
It was a disaster.
Right. It was a disaster because, Muslims in the 14th century ruling in the 20th century, 21st century, that they don't do it well. African nations did not do it well. They haven't. So it's not, we really shouldn't be afraid to say, yeah, decolonization was a mistake. And now guess what? Now they're coming over to Europe and they're destroying all that.
And again, it has to do with giving people the keys to the car they did not buy, they do not know how to maintain, and you're just giving them the keys to the car, expecting them to take responsibility for it. And that's not how it's going to be. Or they're not even inheriting the car as possession from their family.
Good example, like Singapore is the only case where decolonization worked out
Singapore
well.
is
They're also like pretty they're also
But-
pretty multi-ethnic as
but
well.
they're authoritarian.
Yeah, they're super authoritarian.
And I think that's where you get the Si Kuan Lu or the Lee Kuan Yew quote, where it's just like,
in Singapore, I believe their history was they were a British naval base. So they already had sort of a military, more regimented culture there that they could then build a more or less authoritarian city-state off of. So that's a good little history to bring up, Spanish Baptists. Let's power through it.
Scots Irish is worthless. For example, if you read the book Born Fighting by James Webb, my people are Scots and Scots Irish, and going all the way back. And when I read that book Born Fighting, I thought, holy moly, this explains a lot. Right?
Hillbilly Elegy is itself a work of about an ethnos, right?
Correct. I would describe it as a sub-ethnos in the larger. So in Rome, in the Roman Empire, you had all these sub-ethnic groups, but Rome
Sub-ethnos of what, I guess, is the key.
You would say that America is a master ethnos, and there are sub-ethnos underneath that. And again, that's just not really true. And it's not really true.
Well, it is true, but not true in the way he's saying. But I would agree it's not really true of Rome.
Roman was a thing too. And when you have an isolated country and it's just mono-ethnic like Japan, and you don't have an empire, life is simple. All right, everybody's Japanese. But when you have a cosmopolitan empire, you have Saul saying, of the tribe of Benjamin, of this, I'm a citizen of Tarsus, no mean city. I'm a Roman citizen. He's got layers of loyalties that have different things going on. So when I go overseas, I'm a Yankee, but I'm only a Yankee here if I live in New England. Right. So I think that there are things like that have to be factored in. But my heritage, my Scots Irish heritage, is a thing. But I would say this: my Scots Irish heritage is a thing, but it has almost nothing in common with Romanian heritage, which would be just as white.
So I guess the problem with this, and again, we should probably have an entire separate.
So this is the pushback that you were alluding to, by the way.
Well, I mean, I think Schrodinger's race was also.
But the issue here is, I think the deployment of ethnos, as we understand it, and I think there's. This is a far more complicated issue. The scaling up of ethnos has always been a complicated process. And if no other, I think the Roman Empire is a good example, if for no other point, that the wider they expanded Roman citizenship, the more the thing fell apart, right? Caracalla does not actually succeed in pulling the Roman Empire together by just giving everyone Roman citizenship.
That's exactly right.
Right. And so I think what we actually have in the United States, and here I don't mean globally, I mean just on the continent, is an empire made up of several different ethnoses. And the only problem is that most people feel like every ethnos that isn't European is allowed to advocate collectively for its well-being. As where every European ethnos, whether it be a unified white ethnos or whether it be a separate, no one's running around talking about the Scots Irish. No one's running around and talking about the Dutch community as a bloc that's allowed to wield political power and go ahead and argue on its own behalf. And if they do, they're immediately called white nationalists. And so
I would argue for an Anglo-Saxon Protestant establishment. I think that's our heritage, and the Dutch can join it. Or they're not they're not Anglo-Saxon. Just like Justice Scalia was not Anglo-Saxon, but there's a story told of him. He went back to Italy to reconnect with his roots and realize how out of place he was. And he stopped in England on the way home and thought, oh, these are my people. This is my heritage. He belonged to an Anglo-Saxon jurisprudential heritage. I think that is in our DNA, and that is what we can rally around, and that would include blacks. Now, when I was a kid,
No.
I don't think black people would agree with that either.
He's doing
In fact,
everything.
Didn't they have the whole TV show called Roots for that reason? Like,
he's doing everything.
Come on,
you say that black people are part of the American story, which I mean, I guess
it is true. They are.
They're not foundational to America, and America would still be America without them, entirely removed. And again, the Dutch, European nation. Obviously, you have New York that was founded by Dutch, so you do have a colonial state founded by the Dutch.
The Dutch are the reason why why Delaware is a thing, because I believe Dutch people settled in Delaware, and Maryland could not claim Delaware because it had European settlers.
And I believe some of our legal system is partially influenced by the Dutch. I think it's the district attorney. Well, like that sort of. I think that's a Dutch tradition that came. So certain things are inherently Dutch. But again, I mean, to say that obviously
the Dutch and the British were also kind of allies.
The Anglos, the Saxons, and
kind of allies.
Were kind of
fought some wars, though.
I mean, the Anglos and Saxons were kind of Germanic peoples. Then you have the Celts. I mean, again, they're not that different genetically in terms of the wide swath of humanity.
Right. Even if you go back far enough, there's enough common ancestry that kind of makes this point moot. But look, black people aren't going to say that we're the same ethnos as white people.
Yeah, they're going to see.
Why are white people pretending that the reverse is therefore true? Like,
I mean, again, there is waspy.
I'm fine with that.
I mean, there is waspy interest in our politics, but that's probably more, if you really want to go deeper into Tucker Carlson's background in that and all of that, or even some of the MIC, these let's get a competent Pentagon. That faction, which shout out Pete Hegseth for doing some good work, but
yeah,
so there is some interest in old line America that's trying to revive itself, but again, to say that they're that distinct from the Scots-Irish of Appalachia is, I don't buy it, and again, the voters, don't buy it, because it's not like there's a distinct difference between how, white people vote clearly for Trump overwhelmingly. And they're doing it because Trump can tap into their identity, even though he is the waspy New Yorker himself, but he can go to Wisconsin and tap into the blue collar workers there, go to Ohio and clean up.
Yeah.
Obviously he wins every precinct in West Virginia, which is your Scots-Irish. So the idea that Trump is even in with practical examples, he's not branching the various strains of white people it's just not true.
Yeah, I mean, because ethnogenesis has happened, the distinctions between different European groups in the United States is kind of fading away.
Yeah, and
Polish,
again, that's what
Irish, German,
and that's what Dave
English.
Green said to Neil Shenby. Again, he's Hungarian. He's not he doesn't have ancestry that goes all the way back to the Mayflower, yet he can still identify with the Pilgrims of Plymouth Rock.
That's exactly what Doug Wilson said of Antonin Scalia. And yes,
so if that's not ethnogenesis, what is? And again, the Romans, if you actually want to be charitable on the Romans had to expand their citizenship to some extent, especially with the Italian peninsula, because they essentially lost a lot of people in Cana and they bled a lot of their middle class out. So they needed to actually expand and unify. And again, the people of the Italian peninsula became unified because of Hannibal. So they had a shared threat, a common war, which again, America had common war. When you have white people going and dying in Europe for 2 wars, that does a lot to unify the white people in America.
It does. Because
Two wars.
It would seem like a outcome of the I want to say post-war consensus, but I do think it is kind of a natural thing. White people, when they immigrated into the United States, they assimilated into white America. I think if Africans migrate to the United States, they would assimilate into Black America. Like, obviously they're not going to assimilate into white America, but they're going to assimilate into Black America. And again, that process, I don't see anything wrong with. We can just be honest about it. We can be honest that, hey, white people and Black people, they're not going to be one ethnic group. Like, that's not going to happen.
I mean, if they are, then there's no such thing as ethnicity, which is kind of his whole point. If you really want to boil it down, ethnicity means nothing in his argument. Or it can't.
America was cosmopolitan in the ways we were describing. But what we have now, because of Biden's open borders policy and the concerted effort to drive a multiculturalist agenda, what we have now is a cafeteria food fight. We are at the point where the strategy of diluting the American identity has almost worked, right? And it may still work. We don't know.
So I guess, again, I agree with you 100% on the Anglo-Protestant core of the American identity and the need to assimilate to it. I reference it all the time, but Samuel Huntington's Who Are We is a fantastic book on this topic. I highly recommend it. This guy's a center-left Harvard professor, but he comes to the same position you and I are advocating here. That said, we kind of have to decide whether everyone is assimilating, and therefore that's the standard. I think you're right that at some point that was the standard for every community, including the Black community. Or whether we are advocating in different ethnic blocks or not. We like either Black Americans and Asian Americans and whatever Americans are allowed to advocate collectively along with Americans of European descent, however that breaks down, whether as a unified white ethnos or as a separate, regional, wherever your people came from, Germany or whatever. Or we don't do that at all. There has to be a similar standard. So if the Black tribe is allowed to advocate for Black people, then I quickly lose patience with people who are like, oh, well, then no one can mention that there might be a collective problem for other communities of European descent. If we're all doing this together and that's the standard, that's fine. But I just want a consistent answer to this question. And it feels like those are very hard to get even when people are advocating for them.
So if the Black sub-tribe is advocating for the sorts of things that they ought to advocate for, as in leave us alone, don't pick on us, leave us alone, let us live our lives. Well, we were all back again when I was a kid, we were already leaving the whites alone, right? The Blacks were getting the short end of the stick at that time. Because of the unprotected class stuff and the age of entitlement, there has been active discrimination against whites. And I have no problem at all with whites demanding to be left alone. If there are lawsuits that say you can't discriminate against me because I'm white, I'm entirely in favor of that kind of defensive measure, because all you're asking for is to be left alone. And I think that every group in America, Black, yellow, white, whatever, should have the right to insist on being left alone.
Well, like I said, we can definitely turn that into its entire other discussion, so we won't run down that rabbit hole any further. But
I'd love to.
You're muted.
That's the last thing I wanted to show, right? I don't think there's anything.
Yeah, I
else.
mean, they kind of wrap it up after this. That's the big fireworks. And again, you can kind of see Auron was giving him some pushback, but at the same time, you're at the tail end of your conversation. You could drag it on forever, and at the end of the day, you are talking to a boomer who doesn't want to actually acknowledge reality.
Well, Auron MacIntyre is very good at communicating.
He is the boomer whisperer, but at the end of the day, Doug Wilson's going to blink and nod his head to everything that's being said, and then go back to doing whatever he was doing before he got on the Auron MacIntyre show.
Yeah, and one thing that's kind of true, because Auron MacIntyre made the point at the end about either we can all collective bargaining, so to speak. Either we can all, advocate for collective interest, or none of us can.
And again,
but obviously, what's the inevitable outcome is that collectivizing works.
Well, I mean, in the whole
a Republican or Democratic system.
I mean, Auron MacIntyre is the one that's like, yeah, the side that just wants to be left alone will lose every time.
Yes.
And again, Doug Wilson just goes libertarian. Oh, we just want to leave us alone, And again, no, they don't want to leave you alone. And two, they want you to essentially pay for their welfare state.
Another thing that's worth bringing up is we got major issues that should actually be addressed in this country. I'll just use artificial intelligence as the example. That's actually something that, we should probably be addressing. Hey, how are we going to function if people lose their jobs and are replaced and have no work and therefore lose a lot of meaning in their lives? So I don't know. Maybe we should actually be looking at things like tariffs as a good thing. Just saying.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, even if you go back to the whole, he's talking about, oh, black people got the short end of the stick. Well, again, that kind of you advocated for Jeremy Carl and Christopher Caldwell's books, even though they would probably tell you that the Civil Rights Act was a bill of goods sold to the United States that made worse the
Civil Rights
problems.
Act gave us codified feminism as well. It codified.
Well, yeah, eventually
feminism.
does, and again, it eventually gives you the homosexuals and transvestites.
And stripped southern states of the right to control their own voting laws.
And again, America at the time did not want the Civil Rights Act. They did not want what was in it. And they pretty much only thought it would apply to the South. Because, again, there was still some sectional or sectarianism between like the North, South, and West. Because, Nixon being a West Coast president is kind of a big deal, even during that time. Obviously, the South was viewed as antiquated because of Jim Crow. Which,
I think it's like ZZ Top in like the 80s and, maybe even King of the Hill to a lesser degree or to a tail end degree that made the South kind of cool again.
No, Leonard Skinner.
Yeah. Leonard Skinner, and ZZ Top.
Obviously, people moving to Florida because of air conditioning.
The snowbirds. The South, they're now becoming a more cultural hub of the United States after, several decades, 100+ years of being like the backwoods of the United States in how it was popularly considered.
But again, when you have equal weights and measures, which is what Auron was advocating, again, that inevitably means that black people will lose what they currently have. White people will actually gain more, especially in like college admissions. Again, a lot of the programs, jobs, like DEI goes away. When that stuff goes away and they lose, they'll then complain and then collectively act, or like they'll collectivize to get their gimmies back. So again, when you're advocating for equal weights and measures and meritocracy,
they're not going to like the result.
Yes, a lot of those people will not like the results because it means that they lose. And again, women won't like the results either because they're the biggest benefactors of DEI. When you have white women in STEM, white women in law, white women flying helicopters into
law enforcement,
airliners,
military,
like all of that's DEI. And when you have equal weights and measures, they go down, standards go up.
Yeah, and women cop stereotypes. Just saying. I remember the one person didn't like that I said it was a DEI cop in the David Platt documentary. But it's what she was. Wasn't enforcing the law properly.
And again,
was being a henchman for the baddies.
I mean, would Doug Wilson support that? Probably not. I don't think a lot of people would support, or a lot of people that claim to support meritocracy would support what actually would become a meritocracy.
No. And a lot of people that support the Constitution would hate to live under the government of our founding.
Yes. And again, a lot of Stonequire talking points would be proven right. And they would be really upset.
All right. I'll do a last call for questions, but I did see some questions that we got pretty early on. So I'll get to those first. Cleopas says, does Doug Wilson also want to give you a spanking? Now, Doug Wilson has responded to me at times on social media, so I guess I had enough followers to respond to, and he made my day. He's never ratioed me, though. But good question. We'll have to get to the bottom of this. Let's see. Doesn't Doug Wilson making the John Harris book his latest book of the month? Oh, congratulations, John. I didn't know that he did that. Sounds like he's maybe trying to rebuild bridges. I would say no. Do you have a longer answer than that?
He claims to have made Jeremy Carl's book, or not claims to. He did make Jeremy Carl's book of the month. Obviously, I mean, he could just be trend following rather than trend setting. So I think that's an important angle to work with. Maybe it's a bridge building. I think part of the reason he went on Auron MacIntyre is to himself kind of rehabilitate some of his image, because obviously he's tarnished it with a lot of people on the right, but he's going on Auron MacIntyre show. And again, we didn't play a lot of the parts where he kind of appeared very uncomfortable, very rambly. I mean, even his exegesis on the scriptures isn't really the best. And that's putting it lightly. I mean, we saw the Joab quote, or the Joab Abner thing. and which really just speaks to the difficult realities of being a king, even when you're anointed by God's prophet. That being a king still has a lot of political realities, which is evident in the story of David. But yeah, I think it could be trying to build bridges, but I mean, obviously, John Harris is enough of an institution to where people will give him bones here and there.
Yeah, and that's pretty good for John Harris.
Yeah,
and
congratulations.
Yeah, very much a congratulations. It does seem like a courtesy thing for sure that Doug Wilson is definitely trying to get John Harris in the orbit of him.
Again, I don't know what the other choices would have been.
But John Harris also, was a panelist at the Right Response Conference, which he also maligned. So I do have a lot to say about this. I think, John Harris has definitely gone in a different direction recently than he's kind of had a pivot in the direction of his focus recently. I'm still kind of waiting to see what it is what direction where he's going to end up with what he's doing. I haven't gotten his book yet. So, I hope it's a good direction for sure. And I just don't quite understand the direction that John Harris, the ideas that he's trying to unpack with ideology and stuff like that. I don't quite understand the point. So that's, I guess, I don't want to say it's a qualm. But with that said, John Harris, he hasn't alienated Doug Wilson, and he hasn't completely alienated people to his right either. So I don't know. But
well, keep in mind,
I think he has alienated some people on the right.
Just going back to Doug Wilson, he does have a cyclical tendency to, I guess he might be trying to reset certain relations, but obviously when he's wrong, he tends to double and triple down when he's wrong, and then kind of resets the cycle.
This is my long-winded way of saying that I don't think John Harris, if Doug Wilson was trying to rebuild bridges, I don't think this is the move. Like, I think he's being friends with John Harris. Nothing wrong with that. I think he's doing, he's trying to reward a book that he agrees with. Nothing wrong with that. And I think John Harris, he's trying to sell a book. Nothing wrong with that. But I don't think this is...
You don't think there's an actual bridge that was burned between these two that would require...
Yeah, there's not a bridge that's burned. John Harris, I don't think he's burning bridges, but he's definitely shifted his focus that a lot of people haven't understood. I don't think I'm alone in that. So I don't think his focus on ideology is caught on, and maybe Doug Wilson's doing it as a power play. I don't know, but I don't think it's a...
I just think it's a courtesy.
Yeah.
No, I wouldn't overanalyze it personally.
But I do think John Harris's shift on ideology has not... a lot of people aren't going along with it. So I think that's why this is not a bridge building move. So
there's a simple answer, and then there's the more complicated answer as to why there is
market share. Jesus, which way, Western man? That's a question, I guess. And that is definitely the question of our time. That's like the best meme I've made this year, just because of its impact, was the which way reformed man. Try. You got any? We see some questions coming up. What's this one? So strange to consider that Wilson grew up during the race war, hyperfeminism, etc. during the 1960s, and he turned a blind eye to...
Yeah, he's like...
Okay. There's a question in there somewhere.
Yeah, right? Boomer mindset and rose-colored glasses. Yes. Yeah. Again, he grew up during this era, and he doesn't realize that it was as bad as people...
The 1960s was pretty lawless.
Yes.
There's a reason why Nixon was so popular, because he brought back a law and order.
And again, when my theory is that, the reason Jim Crow laws existed was because of behavioral problems in certain communities. And that's why the sign went up that said, no, this, that, and the other thing in the store. And, a lot of those behaviors manifest themselves today and, with certain groups being notoriously bad at tipping, obviously the degradation of the American city. Every single city in America has degraded since the 1960s. Like there's not really an exception to a city that was like great in the 60s that hasn't degraded since then. And that is because of the Civil Rights Act.
I actually think what makes people want to interview Wilson, I think this was a good interview for Auron MacIntyre, actually. I think.
Yeah, and I wasn't expecting this.
Yeah, I wasn't. Yeah, that was actually a really good interview for him. And I think at the end of the day, it was good content. So he was doing his job as a YouTuber. And Spanish Baptist has another good point here. And yeah, they share, Harris and Wilson share a common enemy in Stone Choir. Because, John Harris doesn't like Stone Choir. He sees them as a much bigger deal than I do. So no getting around that. Alrighty. I think that's it. If you like Evangelical Dark Web, you can subscribe to the channel, to the podcast if you're new. Also check out Winning Not Winsome, my book, over at Amazon. It's on sale on Amazon, I guess. So I don't know. And we have a Patreon-like system. You can get access to bonus content. Also linked in the description below. Have a blessed day. Stay based, Christ is King, and we will catch you on the next one.